Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is the membership group for animal studies scholars in Australia and around the world. Membership is very reasonable at just $50 Australian. So if you're not a member of ASA, you should think about joining. Membership fees is what keeps the organisation running, and they do very good work, including organising a biannual conference. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from that conference, from the 2017 conference, which is being held at the University of Adelaide. It's a very grey and rainy and cold day here at Adelaide, but we have wonderful ideas flowing through the corridors of the University of Adelaide, and I'm very lucky to be joined by one of our speakers at the conference. So my guest this episode is C. Scott Taylor, known as Scott. Scott has been at the University of Sunshine Coast, and today he's going to be discussing his paper, The Agony of Dolphins Towards Inter-species Embassies as Sites of Engagement of Significant Others, which appeared in Geographical Research in 2013. Welcome to the podcast, Scott.
Oh, thank you. Hello. Might I say it's not the agony of dolphins, although that might be a good way of describing the situation. It's the agency of dolphins.
Beg your pardon.
That's all
it's
right.
Tradition for me to get everything wrong, including people's names and their titles. The Agency of Dolphins. Beg your pardon.
There you go.
Can you start by telling us what inspired you to write this article?
Well, I have a very long history of fascination with the relationship of human beings to dolphins, over 30 years now, actually. And along the way, I've spent a lot of time in places where people interact with dolphins. And I'm very fascinated by the fact that dolphins approach human beings, and they have throughout human history, as a matter of fact. They by their own initiative, they choose to come and spend time interacting with, communicating with, playing with, and sometimes even teaching human beings. So going to places where they do that, I find that there are various issues and pressures that arise that cause local legislative bodies, authorities, to come up with management schemes for those interactions, typically driven by conservation science, by local voices that very often don't really have much understanding about what's really going on. And then I also, because I've been among those communities of people who have on a regular basis interacted with those dolphins, I've really not seen the kind of problems that are so often thought of as key issues. So what I wanted to do was really look closely at what are those management schemes, what management schemes are in place, and how then how do people try to control this situation? And what I find is that there is a very much a lack of the consideration of the fact that the dolphins themselves are choosing to do it. So the specific focus is on the agency of dolphins. And eventually I came to recognize that what I was always seeing, whether it was in public discourse or official discourse and even academic discourse, was a reference to animals as being ambassadors. So I just took one logical step past that and thought, well, especially where dolphins choose to come and visit us in the wild, why don't we, as we attempt to create adequate management schemes, why don't we begin to think of those places as embassies? So what is an embassy? An embassy is a space that's mutually agreed upon where civility will be the key factor in the relationship. There will be mutual respect, and there will be an attempt to kind of negotiate a way of communicating so that there will be beneficial outcomes for everyone. I think that's an adequate definition of what an embassy is in human activity. So why not at an interspecies level? Why can't we think of those spaces from that? perspective. So that then calls up questions about things like, well, what is interspecies etiquette? How might we actually have a civil relationship with dolphins where we don't do mean and impolite things to them, and how do we prevent them from harms that human beings may visit on them? There's not much, of course, that we can do with animals in the wild as far as training or impressing upon them kinds of behaviors that are okay for us. So really, in situations like this, it's very much on the human side. And that can be done and has shown to be done. In fact, it's been very, very successful in various places in the world. But those places are typically not used as models for the creation of these management schemes.
So, Scott, there is, as you note, quite a lot of tourism that takes place around meetings with dolphins and with whales, etc. Do you differentiate between these tourist attractions that are managed well and are managed poorly?
Oh, yeah, sure. There are really sad situations. I'll just pick one, but off the north coast of the island of Bali for quite some time, there's been advertisements to tourists and that sort of thing to come and spend time with the dolphins there. We'll for a few rupees, we'll put you in a boat and take you out, and you can be among the dolphins. Well, because there was really no kind of management of that, and locals really did not actually have a tradition of interacting with the dolphins, their response was basically to take people out and do what they had always done, which is when they're in their fishing practices, which is to use their boats, and now, of course, with the high-powered motors, to round up the fish so they could net them. Well, so the idea was simply, well, let's just round up the dolphins. That way we can get close to them. Well, that's a very poor idea, and what has happened as a result of that is the dolphins have generally abandoned that area. They don't go there anymore because it's been really terrifying for them and very hard for them. Now, I know people who went to that coastline and spent time interacting with those local dolphins 25 years ago, and what they described was an idyllic kind of situation. But in that case, the locals didn't really quite have the understanding to be able to self-manage, and the government really had no interest in that at the time. So, that's a situation where an opportunity and a situation was damaged and lost. Not permanently, I don't think.
So if we turn our attention then to operations that are well managed, how do you look to see that the dolphin is actually showing agency or is desiring to be there and part of the interaction?
Well, I can think of two key places. One is Dingle Bay in Ireland, on the west coast of Ireland. There's a dolphin there by the name of Fungi, and he's been interacting with people since the early 1980s. And he lives nearby, apparently spends some of his resting time in a kind of a sea cave just down the coast a little way. And he comes almost every single day into the harbor, and he loves to, come up to rowboats and grab the oars that people stick in the water. He's been known to literally jump right over boats and splash people. He's had a close and careful relationship with human beings for decades now. And fortunately, the first people to interact with him there was a fisherman who saw him approaching boats, and he was very careful to interact with a dolphin in a very respectful kind of a way, and he encouraged other people to not, crowd him and that sort of thing. And the local community took this on. So the community became the guardians quite naturally by their own accord. And since then, the guardianship of Fungi has gone into some kind of legislative model, and there is something of a management scheme, but it's really basically guided by I suppose you'd call the social pressure of the local community and what they provide, because it's a kind of isolated little town, and to go there you need to sort of rent accommodations from the locals, and the locals are going to tell you, don't you mess with our dolphin, you be nice, you be polite. So the self-management side of that is very good. There can be no question but that Fungi himself is choosing to come and spend time with human beings. He's self-habituated, you might say. The other key location is Kealakekua Bay on the big island of Hawaii. And this is a place that has been studied by conservationists, biologists since around the 70s. studying of a population of spinner dolphins. Now, there are various kinds of dolphins and even small whales that come into this bay. It's traditionally, historically, of the place where Captain Cook visited, the King of Hawaii, spent a long time there, eventually returned and was killed there. That's Captain Cook's grave is there, as a memorial there for him. But the study of the spinner dolphin population as a place where they come in to spend their daylight hours. Dolphins basically feed at night. So they get very active late in the afternoon and head out to sea. So the morning and early afternoon is an ideal time for them to come in and spend resting time and socializing time. And so this was identified through the scientific community and then eventually by the community of people looking to interact with dolphins for various reasons. A well-known person who advocates human interaction with dolphins bought a home right there on the bay, and she began to lead tours out to swim with those dolphins. And there have been, I would venture to say, hundreds of thousands of people who have gone to Kealakekua Bay and swum out with those dolphins. Now, among the local people, including this person that I'm talking about, they say that they very, very rarely see anybody acting inappropriately. And if they do, there is so much immediate response by other people in the water to get them to stop doing what they're doing, which might be, too rapidly pursuing or using a kayak and being a bit forceful around the dolphins or something like that. Or even getting in the middle of a resting pod, which is something that the locals have learned not to do. That peer pressure stops them. And so it is ideally a self-managing situation. But what has happened is that the scientific community, because of the long-standing observation posts on the cliffs overlooking that are frequently populated by, doctoral students and people, pursuing a career in cetacean science, they take up position there and they sit with their binoculars. And these are people who, because of their supposed objectivity, will refuse to get in the water with the dolphins. And they'll observe from afar. And because of that, they feel that they have an even better understanding of what's going on than the people who are in the water. But they are observing from afar. And their conclusion is, these statistics show that there was less movement during this particular time, or was this kind of movement during another period, and there were humans in the water at that time, et cetera, et cetera. So a constructed model of what the dolphin behavior is as related to the human behavior has led to proposals to create a very, very restrictive management scheme. Now, to the indigenous Hawaiians, this is horrific. This is an idea that completely offends their traditional knowledge and interactions with these animals. And then to people who are very experienced, there's been a proposal in place for many, many years that there be a local kind of a ranger organization, be authenticated, be given some kinds of authority. They should be given some kind of a shirt that they can wear to identify them, and that these people be even employed to be there to interact with people who come to visit with the dolphins, to make sure that people do understand how to carry out proper dolphin etiquette.
So, Scott, in your view, can human-dolphin interactions, for example, be beneficial for the dolphins?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about that in my mind. And that, particularly when you take into account the agency of the dolphins, their choice to do it. I can't imagine that they would be doing it if they didn't find some benefit in it, for one thing. And then when we look at what we know about dolphins who are in human care, one of the things that is extremely enriching to them, it benefits them in their environment, is to have interaction with human beings, because humans have a way of establishing a kind of consistency that dolphins find really fascinating. This is my experience of it, and many trainers' experience, that the idea that a human being will do something more than once, and that there will be some kind of positive aspect to that for a dolphin is quite fascinating. Because when you think of it, dolphins don't really see that anywhere else in their world, whether in the wild or anywhere else. Human beings do have this remarkable way of being consistent and repeating things, which, as many a trainer has said, people can think that I'm training the dolphin, but the truth is the dolphin's training me. So I think that there are very good, strong arguments for the fact that, in fact, the dolphins are getting something positive out of this.
Do you have concerns about dolphins who find themselves at places like SeaWorld or aquatic shows of that nature?
Well, yes, I do, and that's really very much at the center of my work. And my concerns are primarily that people have got a mistaken impression of what's going on there, and that there is what must be taken into account is that we have what I call legacy dolphins, or another way of putting it is dolphins with nowhere else to go. These are animals who either themselves, if they're 40, 50 years old, many of which are, were captured themselves when they were young, but at a time when the collecting of marine specimens was completely unremarkable. No one gave thought to that, or really collecting most animals. It wasn't a conservation issue. There was no imagination that was a problem, until eventually we came to realize, well, it actually is a problem, and an increasingly more concerning problem. But we do have these dolphins. At this point, their behavioral repertoire is so poor. Has been extinguished. Their survival skills, they've adapted very well to human care, and have become quite successful in surviving among humans. So you have them, and then you have their offspring. And their offspring, of course, never having known the ocean, can't be returned to the ocean. But what we do see there is a kind of mutualism, a kind of extremely rich environment in which humans and dolphins both gain by the intersection of their lives. And this, to me, is something which is largely overlooked. It is erased in the animal liberationist discourse. It's something which is highly contested, and something which I agree is not always an easy thing to really wrap your head around on first glance.
So are you saying that your sense is that dolphins who are either long-term residents or the offspring of long-term residents, really they need to live out the rest of their life in captivity, but that there are now better ways to interact with dolphins? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm not sure about the question there, but the dolphins who have nowhere else to go, they are a long-term responsibility for human beings, and they will be for the foreseeable future. That's to me, that's inescapable. I think that, and because there's another population that was not mentioned there, and that is the animals that are stranded, who will only survive if they're given long-term care. Now, a serious problem in that is that legislation in various parts of the world, England is a prime example of it, Australia is moving rapidly in this direction, which I find very alarming, and that is what's called the two-option policy. And the two-option policy basically says if an animal can be refloated when it's found on a beach within a matter of a few hours, then it's released back into the ocean. The other option is to kill it on the beach. The window is closing for animals who could, if taken into care, be given long-term rehabilitation, and then if they can be released. If not, the promise is made, the commitment is made to lifelong care. I personally know several dolphins who fit into that category. One in particular who was rescued. She had fishing gear wrapped around her tail. She was rehabilitated over a couple of months, put back in the ocean, and then about 6 weeks later she was found again, this time with 10 kilos worth of fishing gear wrapped around her tail nearly severed with a huge shark bite on her side. She was taken into care. It took them nearly a year to get her really back to health, and it was clearly evident that there was no way she was going to survive in the ocean. So at that point then, do you simply euthanize her, or do you promise her a lifetime of care?
And who were the caregivers?
Who are the caregivers?
Yeah.
There are people who have trained themselves, and people who are university trained, who are veterinarians, and people who have made a lifetime commitment to caring for all kinds of rescued animals.
And what's the enclosure that the animal would live in?
They're in an artificial enclosure.
Right. So at sea kind of thing, or could you describe the enclosure, for example?
This particular one is two concrete pools. One is relatively small, I suppose you would say, probably twice the size of an average sort of suburban backyard swimming pool, large one. And then another one is, 8 to 10 times that size. And but this is again one of those situations where historical context really must play a role in the story. This place was established as a marine animal, or really Australian animal, but particularly focused on marine animal rescue and rehabilitation facility. And it was done on a piece of land which was ideal to put it because it's right next to an estuary, so they can pump seawater straight into these pools. And they basically put it through a sand filtering system with a computer-controlled tiny amounts of little chemicals that are put in just to make sure the water stays clean and is healthy and pathogen-free, that sort of thing. But because at the time this was the ideal location for them, what was not really taken into consideration, and this is an issue that is actually fairly common along the Australian coastline. The pool could not be built as deep as one would have liked, simply because it's literally a concrete bowl floating in sand, which is permeated with seawater underneath. So it could only be so deep. So they compensated by that by making it wide and making it as accommodating as possible. Now, there's a dolphin in there who's been there for 47 years, and he spent most of those 47 years in the smaller pool before the larger pool was built. And I've spent literally well over 100 hours underwater. I'm only talking about the underwater time that I've spent with that particular dolphin in various projects that I've been involved in. And this is a dolphin who I would say has adapted extraordinarily well to his life. He simply would not have been alive if he'd not been rescued. This is a dolphin who, without human intervention, simply would not be. And this is a dolphin who, quite literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Australian children have been able to walk up to the side of the pool and play catch with him, touch him, experience the presence of this extraordinary animal who is friendly and happy, and he seems to be well adapted. Now, certainly, his life circumstances are diminished when you compare them to that in the wild. They're different, but different isn't wrong. Different is just different. And this is a dolphin who I would say has had an extraordinary life and has created extraordinary effects, has given memories and experiences to so many human beings. I have to say that there's value on both sides there. And to ignore that, I think, is a serious mistake.
Scott, thank you. Now, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I'll give it a try, yeah.
Okay, now, a lot of people who come on this program are what we call animal studies scholars, so the questions might need a little bit of adaptation for you, but we'll give it a go and see how well we go.
No problem.
So can you recall the first piece of what I call pro-animal scholarship you ever read, or something in defence of animals?
Well, animal geography is just really what drew me into my second era of academic work. So really the book Animal Geographies and Animal Spaces, Beastly Places, those were key works. Those quickly led me to Donna Haraway, who led me to Vicky Hearn, and et cetera. So those were very seminal for me. And
can you remember the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, I would say that it would have to be my honors thesis, my honors dissertation, which was in some ways similar to the article. The article that you linked to references that paper. So,
if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, it's tough to name just one, but I would have to say, I'll bend the rule a little bit. I will say Vicky Hearn and I would say Kathy Rudy. Both of the two of them have shown me how it's possible to study the animal-human relationship from the affective side and to bring philosophy and true deep ethics to the question from another perspective. So those two I think have been very important.
What's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Well, what can they do? I think that they can, in their work, they can decenter the human being from the study. I think that the concerns that we express as animal scholars are very often about what the human perspective is, what the human effects are, what the human responsibilities are. And I think that really needs to be shifted more away from the human perspective. Now, that brings up methodological questions and that sort of thing, but I just find so much of what's going on in animal scholarship to be very human-centric.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I would really encourage every animal scholar to go out of their way to encounter, engage with, and get very close to an animal who is not one that they normally find themselves attracted to. And hopefully find someone who is an expert in the interaction with that animal to be a guide into that other world, to maybe give that idea, that sense of what it's like to look at the world from that other perspective.
So, Scott, what are you working on next?
Well, several things. I'm working on a book about dolphin-assisted therapy, which is what my doctoral research was on. I'm also looking at how I can find an effective way to counter the work of someone who is very influential, whose academic credentials in my experience and my study, my careful study of the life of a body of her work, has been seriously compromised by various factors, and yet she remains very influential. And I'd like to find some way to respectfully but very effectively counter some of the arguments and positions she's taken, because she is influential and she's really mistaken.
So how can people find out more about your work?
Well, one good way, and I promise to do a bit more updating than I have in a while, is through my blog, which is Dolphin Embassy at blogspot.com.au. So there you'll find interesting links and some articles I've written, and yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Scott, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast, where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals. You can also follow me at SO_S, or you can like us on Facebook at Knowing Animals, or you can like me on Facebook at Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan. Don't forget to tell other people about the podcast. As we say, pod it forward, and don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.